Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second plenary. And we're looking today at the topic for our plenary is sociological research and practice in authoritarian times. And we have 4 speakers on the panel. I will introduce them in turn. I will start by giving a preamble and then introduce each speaker prior to the presentation. I'm Josephine Beoku-Betts. I'm the organizer of this panel. In the recent past, we found, well, actually, the idea of right-wing, racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Islamic, homophobic, anti-immigration protest movements, these are becoming very, very popular now, but they've really existed for a long time in history. And the intensification and global expansion of these movements through, I think these days, through the use of digital technology, social media, has culminated in mass protest movements and for democratization and social equality in the world today. And in my own area, for example, which is women, gender, and sexuality studies, you find that women's rights, gender, and sexual equality issues, and even issues like rights of citizenship, anti-immigration movements are particular targets that something sounds like it's echoing. Sorry. Yeah, particular targets for these extremist mobilizations and hate practices of these authoritarian and fundamentalist religious movements. And they've opened spaces for the inscription or reinforcement of gender, sexual, class, nationality, and other inequalities. For example, Africa, which is where I do most of my work, you find that many of the authoritarian regimes support these extremist mobilizations and these hate practices. And you find that they're using homophobic and misogynistic threats to control various forms of activism in response to these right-wing mobilizations. For example, in Uganda, in 2014, the Anti-Homosexuality Act was passed as a law to erase non-heteronormative sexual and gender non-conforming identities from dominant representations of the state. I think they even had life imprisonment and execution if you were found to be in a same-sex relationship. So this panel this afternoon will focus on the prospects, the opportunities, the challenges that sociologists face as they work in their own respective contexts, and as they find how they are increasingly being challenged by authoritarian and political ideologies and practices. And the panel will draw on their own work as feminist sociologists and reflect on contemporary challenges that they face in their work, facing the discipline, looking at how, for example, academic institutions, how we're responding to the intensification of these right-wing policies and practices, and what opportunities and challenges are presented to us. How do they address and navigate these critical developments in their research? And you know, what new insights, whether theoretical, methodological, scholar activism, what new insights can we share as sociologists as we try to navigate these various processes? So it's fairly broad, and the speakers can interpret it in whichever way they feel comfortable doing. I'll start by introducing Dr. Mary Romero, whose paper is entitled Retrenching or Establishing a Sociology from the Margins. Dr. Romero is Professor Emerita for Justice and Social Inquiry in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. She served as the 110th president of the American Sociological Association. She is the 2017 recipient of the Cox Johnson Fraser Award, 2015 Latina Latinx, let's just say, Sociology Section Founders Award, the 2012 Julian Samora Distinguished Career Award, the section on Race and Ethnic Minorities, 2009 Founders Award, and the 2004 Study of Social Problems Lee Founders Award. She is the author of Introducing Sexuality, which was published by Polity Press in 2018, The Maid's Daughter, Inside and Outside the American Dream, New York University Press, 2011, which I use in my class, by the way. Made in the USA, published by New York University Press in 1992. And she's the co-editor of 8 books and numerous social science journals and law review articles. So I welcome you, Mary, and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel, Josephine. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the work of the program committee changing this conference to meet the needs that we're currently in today. I began by acknowledging with respect that I'm speaking from the ancestral homelands of those indigenous tribes that have been inhabited this land for centuries, including the Pima and the Maricopa peoples. Globally, we've seen a growing number of authoritarian regimes, political ideologies, and practices. Given the growing inequalities in the United States, we have had the ingredients for an authoritarian government for a while, but the Trump administration has pushed this into reality through immigration restrictions, responding to largely peaceful protests with armed military, and characterizing them as terrorists, discrediting political opposition as advocating violence and being unpatriotic, eroding the voting rights laws, police targeting members of the media, and the repeated depiction of journalists' fact reporting as fake news, attacking the legitimacy of science and dismissing evidence-based research findings and researchers conducting research. Trump began his administration by destroying climate information and removing federal websites. Within a year into his presidency, climate change, science, and policy on federal websites underwent major overhauls and at times completely disappeared. We have seen the continued anti-science and lack of evidence-based research in discussing everything from hurricanes to COVID-19. The Trump administration is not alone in these practices. We know the Bush and the Obama administration also changed codes and categories to coincide with their policies. However, the Trump administration has gone much further to transform data collection, including destroying the means of maintaining reliable data, as evident as the record keeping of COVID-19 cases and deaths. Josephine has asked us to address the prospects, opportunities, and challenges that sociologists face as we work in an increasingly authoritarian climate of ideologies and practices. Before turning to higher education, I want to make some brief observations about ASA. As the past president of the American Sociological Association, I do worry about the erosion of democratic practices and the move toward accepting practices that lessen the associations as a member directed to a director, executive office directed. The type of historical detail that I discussed in New York City last year is unlikely in the future, given the move to write skeleton minutes, classifying all council and committee materials as confidential, and openly violating the bylaw requirement for annual reports of the secretary to the membership for the last 4 years. Like our presidential administration, budget categories have been modified and are less transparent than in the past. The drastic change in ASA personnel over the last 4 years, along with the constant turnover of elected officials and council members, assures the erasure of institutional memory and the implementation of less democratic modes of operating. Probably the most disturbing practice is a requirement for unflinching loyalty that silences members' concerns, and the practice to meet dissent with character assassination, discrediting any opposition or critique. Members need to be able to discuss and decide our own direction of the association. The existing hierarchy and inequality in higher education makes universities and colleges vulnerable to authoritarian practices. We have seen universities and colleges adopting similar practices. Probably one of the most common practice is a lack of transparency. We find this in budget allocations, faculty raises, and course releases. The most recent example from my own university is one straight out of the Trump administration. Earlier this week, the following announcement was made. University officials are not planning to publish or announce data referring to the number of students, faculty, and staff who test positive for the virus. A university spokesperson stated, "Knowing how many cases may be present in our community does not give members of our community useful information about whether they particularly may need to take extra precautions." Instead, as students, faculty, and staff head back to begin the fall semester, they must rely on data provided by the Arizona Department of Health Services, which tracks COVID-19 positives by zip code and county. While the university announced that the classrooms will receive a thoroughly cleaning once a day and high-touch surfaces cleaned twice daily, cleaning products will be available in each classroom for students, teaching assistants, and faculty to disinfect their personal space within the classroom and laboratories before and after use. Even though mask and social distancing is required, even with splitting classes attendance and having more online classes, keeping social distance in the halls, the stairways, and walking on campus will be challenging for a university which has an enrollment of over 90,000 students in 2019. Given the inequalities built into the teaching system, adjunct and part-time faculty are now being told that in-person teaching are the only positions available to them in the fall. In addition, we have seen large numbers of teaching staff cut in anticipation of declining enrollments. Many academic schools and departments have no resemblance of a democratic community. Over the last 2 decades, we have observed eroding faculty governance at state universities and the push for researchers to work on team state-supported corporate grants. Like many universities, Arizona State University has accepted money from the financial elite, such as the right-wing Koch brothers. In secrecy, conservative legislatures in the Arizona Assembly included funding for the new school embedded in the overall annual location for public universities in the state. This is how the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership was established. It houses 2 think tanks established by the Koch brothers to use public money that support Arizona conservative projects. By establishing it as its own school, they began hiring faculty with their conservative views and were exempt from the usual hiring protocols. Initiatives originally set up to hire underrepresented faculty or leading scholars in the field were used to hire faculty based on their conservative credentials. Universities and colleges developed strategies for addressing the financial concerns developed by COVID-19. Sociologists engaged in interdisciplinary programs might find themselves under attack. Given the number of women and LGBTQ sociologists housed in women and gender studies and sociologists of color in racial, ethnic, and indigenous studies, all sociologists must advocate on their behalf when faced by administrative cuts to budgets, teaching positions, and programs themselves. The study of social inequality is central to most sociologists' curriculum development and research proposals. As faculty members, sociologists are confronted with an increasingly hostile teaching and research environment, engulfed in the politics of bigotry and hate, surrounding us with a spectacle of fear, divisions, and disinformation. Many of us find ourselves in vulnerable positions in the classroom, teaching courses on race relations, gender and society, the sociology of sexuality, or immigration. We are teaching in a time of great divisions in society, strong nativist sentiment, intense nationalism, pervasive misogyny, and racial violence. We find ourselves confronted by students explaining research findings as opinions and arguing that their non-evidence-based statements are simply alternative facts, instead of speaking truth, evidence, and facts. We assign readings on the history of racial immigration laws at a time that the Trump administration treats millions of undocumented immigrants as potential terrorists and criminals, and treating migrant families as disposable by separating children and parents, and placing them in detention and denying asylum hearings. We lecture on wealth and poverty in the United States at a time that the Republican leaders argue that more than $200 a month is a disincentive for adults to go out to work during the pandemic. Teaching sociology is crucial in these times. We need to teach students the reasons that education is essential for a democratic society. We must incorporate educational policies and practices that provide the basis for imagining a US society and a world that is not immersed in a massive inequality. Livelihoods that do not rely on the erosion of the environment, and working toward a just nation rather than a militarized one. We need to show students the value of education and critical thinking, rejecting administrative pressure to train students and create new credentials, but rather engage students to use knowledge to critique the world and to intervene in socially responsive ways. Students need to develop a sociological imagination to critically examine state and corporate oppression and to imagine a just world in which they can begin to work toward achieving in their lifetime. They need to think of freedom in terms of human rights rather than freedom as Adorno lamented as the right of the stronger and the richer to take from the weaker and the poorer. Students need to be empowered to pursue the intersectionality of sociology and human rights. Sociologists need to be invested in the struggle to make education a right rather than a luxury, which only the rich can afford and others become buried under loan debt. The increasing rising cost of higher education excludes many from access to higher education, higher paying careers, and makes a mockery out of any claims of having a meritocracy. Denying generations access to higher education not only maintains inequality in the United States, but also increases the social and economic inequality gap. Democracy is unable to survive in a growing environment of anti-intellectualism. Furthermore, digital technology is vital for participation in discourse, cultural life, and scientific research. Access to technology and computer literacy is essential and should be accompanied with the process of accountability for tech companies. Only by establishing new institutional protocols and norms around the use of information technology can we protect the public from the abuse for profit and continuing state surveillance. We must work to maintain the internet as a tool of freedom. In responding to the Trump administration's attack on science, multidisciplinary scientific societies have organized to protect scholarly freedom, protect access to data, transparency, and scientific review processes. However, some have used this as an opportunity to argue for value-free research and to assuming an apolitical stance. There has always been a tendency among mainstream US sociologists. However, there is a lot of truth to the saying, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. A posture of apolitical is a posture of complacency. Supporting free inquiry and expression in the abstract is all well and good, but in the face of peaceful protesters being beaten and gassed, we need to do more. Supporting people of all different backgrounds is a noble pursuit, but when specific racial groups are targeted by the state, we must stand among them and resist. Sociologists need to advocate for inclusion of faculty, staff, and students of color, LGBTQ, Indigenous, undocumented, and disabled. Our teaching, research, and service should not be complicit to the appropriation of religious traditions, beliefs, and institutions that persecute others with violent suppression to maintain their dominance and conceal corruption. To do otherwise assures a subjugated sociology with no value, one that functions to justify an authoritarian government rather than developing creative ways of collecting information about state behavior and developing the knowledge of resistance and resiliency away from authoritarianism. Under Trump, we have already seen the country close to international scholars and students. This action fits into a pattern of action taken by authoritarian type regimes supporting national forms of science As we have seen in the race for COVID-19 vaccine, nationalism is separating scientists from collaborating their expertise and resources. Many within sociology already have seen the limitations of US sociology, which blinds us to the wealth of new knowledge and the new opportunities for collaborative and comparative research. The ASA, SWS, and SSSP are strengthened in exchanges with international scholars at our annual meetings and having them published in our association journals. One of our international guests from India last year was unable to participate in person due to the travel bans imposed by Trump. While she did send a video of her presentation, the experience is not the same as having the opportunity to engage with the other panelists in the plenary session, nor were the attendees able to discuss or discuss research findings or seek new ideas to explore in their research and teaching. Attending the International Sociological Association meetings allows us to exchange knowledge, ideas, and develop networks across national borders to address global issues. Along with the International Sociological Association, we've also gained from initiatives like the Sociologists Without Borders. Founded in Madrid, 2001, this non-governmental organization has active chapters around the world. Unlike narrowly defined objectives of the ASA, Sociologists Without Borders advances human rights and the protection of the common or collective good, including sustainable environment, transparent laws or collective goods, including a sustainable environment, transparent laws and government, and natural resources, the internet and information grids, fair trade, the rights of farmers and fishers to manage their own resources, and participatory democracy. The American Sociological Association, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, and Sociologists Without Borders are members of the Science and Human Rights Coalition of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Applying the tenets of science and human rights outlined by the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2017, we can identify 5 connections between human rights and sociology. Sociology can be applied to human rights, and we must recognize that conducting and applying sociological knowledge can have negative human rights impact. These is to recognize rights to science, which was recognized in the Universal International Human Rights and in the international treaties. Sociologists can serve as a constituency for human rights. Sociologists globally must support each other's fights to stay independent from state and the freedom to engage in creative projects, independent research projects, and to develop international connections independent of the state's interests. We cannot allow sociologists to travel to parts of the world where they feel their safety is in jeopardy because of their skin color, religious beliefs, or sexual orientation. We cannot allow them to feel alone, but they must feel part of a global conversation of sociology that sheds light on issues affecting our discipline. We share their human rights of their profession, that is the freedom of expression, the freedom of information, and the freedom of movement. Allowing and promoting international travel among scholars and scientists is important for sociologists to share in this conversation. International networks are also crucial in maintaining diversified international advisory councils that can evaluate and consider the direction, ethics, and feasibility of research agendas and policies. As the American Association of Advancement of Science statement opposing restriction on immigration visas stated, preventing highly skilled scientists and postdocs from entering the United States will harm American science and threatens our scientific leadership. Immigrant sociologists have made significant contributions to our discipline. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Josephine, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much, Mary. That really was very rich and insightful and gives us a lot of food for thought, especially at the time we're living in now. And what's interesting is that we can apply this to what's going on in other parts of the world as well, which our speakers are going to be talking about in Iran and other parts of, Iran and So Brazil, I know that Eloísa is talking about a number of other places. So thank you very much. I know this will give us, please, if you have any questions, comments, send them through the chat. And when we finish, we will come back and be able to discuss all of this because there's a lot we have to talk about today. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Nazanin Shahrokni, and her presentation is entitled Resilience in the Face of Adversity, Charting the Contours of Iranian Sociology. Nazanin is an assistant professor of gender and globalization at the London School of Economics. She is the author of Women in Place, The Politics of Gender Segregation in Iran, published by the University of California Press in January 2020. Her book just won the Latife Yashata Book Award from the Association for Iranian Studies. Nazanin has a PhD in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley and is currently on the executive committee of the International Sociological Association. Welcome, Nazanin.
Thank you. Thank you, Josephine. Good afternoon, everyone. And again, thank you, Josephine, for the invitation and also for the opportunity to bring the Iranian sociology and actually its connection to the US foreign policy to the spotlight. And it's only befitting that I'm following Mary because I can kind of show how the domestic politics are actually very much connected to international politics and how what's happening in the US is actually affecting Iran, sociology in Iran and sociologists in Iran. I've prepared a PowerPoint, so I'm going to, with your permission, to just share my screen. And I think what that means is that I'll be off the screen. So just, okay. Does everything look okay? Okay.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
All right, perfect. Okay. So in April, the International Sociological Association, where I serve as a member on of the executive committee, received a letter signed by the president of the Iranian Sociological Association, who called attention to the combined impact of US-imposed economic sanctions and the COVID-19 pandemic on the profession of Iranian sociology. The situation is dire, he wrote, as he invited international colleagues to stand in solidarity with their Iranian counterparts against the sanctions. Unlike many talks and articles that document the pernicious effects of sanctions on Iran's economy and social fabric in general, I want to turn our attention to the reach of the sanctions in unlikely, often overlooked places, such as in the works of Iran's embattled scholarly communities that are already politically and economically circumscribed. Some of the constraints on the Iranian sociological field are also encountered in other societies of the region and beyond. There are, however, particular constellations of social actors, institutional dynamics, and external pressures that affect the development of Iran's sociological field. The public sphere in Iran, including the realm of sociological research and study, is shrinking as a result of both domestic political restrictions and international adversity in the form of economic sanctions. These pressures are weakening the sociological imagination of the public, as well as closing horizons by limiting Iranian sociologists' access to international spaces and isolating them from the rest of the sociological community. In what follows, I will first chart the contours of Iranian sociology and discuss domestic constraints such as Islamization, state clientelism, but also the securitization or criminalization of sociology in Iran, along with international constraints, most important among them, the US-imposed economic sanctions. I will end this talk with a discussion about why this should matter to those of us who believe in a global sociology and pursue the internationalization of social sciences. So let's go back to the very beginnings to the 1979. When the Islamic Revolution happened. From the beginning of the 1979 revolution and the subsequent establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran, sociologists have fought for the preservation of their discipline as the Islamization drive brought it almost to the verge of extinction. So the Islamization drive, part of the Islamization drive was also the Islamization of knowledge. And it was kind of accompanied by, but also intensified by indigenization of knowledge as well. And sociology was presented as a Western science that needed to be rethought. It took sociologists several years to put their discipline back into the academic curriculum. In 1989, with the ascendance of a developmentalist agenda, sociology was presented as a problem-solving instrument that could facilitate the attainment of the state's development goals. During this period, a group of 17 sociologists mobilized and successfully campaigned for the establishment of a professional association. After securing the discipline's survival, it was time to pursue its institutionalization and advancement. In 1991, the Iranian Sociological Association was born. It eventually found a permanent home at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Tehran University. The association has now more than 500 members, while its Telegram channel and online messaging community keeps its more than 6,000 followers abreast of developments and activities. It hosts 2 major peer-reviewed journals and has developed into an enormous organization with 52 scientific working groups and 40 provincial offices. The provincial offices are central to the association's effort to maintain its national relevance and to better integrate sociologists from the country's periphery in its work. Provincial offices usually reach out to local universities for working space, which deepens the links of the association, which is based in the capital, with peripheral higher education institutions. From its humble beginnings, the association managed to boost scholarly morale, provide a home for the country's sociologists in line with the aspiration of its original founders, establish roots in local and national social context, and also play an important role in strengthening social science research infrastructure. Over the past 20 years, the Iranian Sociological Association has worked to build upon its earlier breakthrough, both at the domestic and international level. Inside Iran, sociologists work relentlessly to explore and determine the contours of what could be called Iranian sociology. They also reaffirm sociology's relevance by engaging in and informing public debates, thus contributing to the formulation of societal problems and challenges. To this end, the Iranian Sociological Association has successfully launched a series of annual national conferences, one called Conceptual and Theoretical Reflections on Iranian Society and another Social Pathologies of Iranian Society. These conferences, unlike many of the conferences that we attend in the US, have brought together sociologists, journalists, policymakers, and the general public, and have generated discussions that have spilled over to the outside world, to newspaper headlines, and into social media. In addition to its regular events, the Iranian Sociological Association and its members have been engaging in public debates by giving interviews and writing op-eds on socially significant and often controversial issues, such as child marriage, increasing class inequalities, the feminization of poverty, domestic violence, students' right to protest, and adolescent health and development, to name but a few. A further step in the development of the Iranian Sociological Association's role centered on turning the association into a research hub, undertaking projects with state authorities and agencies. This development allowed it to tap into state funds, a vital source of income that provided 10 to 20% of overhead costs to the association. Becoming a hub also enabled it to involve regional offices in research with national or regional policy impacts. So basically, the association turned into a research institution where it would apply for state grants, it would design projects, and then would distribute the projects among its members or among its provincial offices. As the association grew roots inside Iran, it sought to establish durable links with international scholarly communities after years of isolation. This effort came to fruition when it joined the International Sociological Association in 2005. 3 years later, a visit by then president of the International Sociological Association, Professor Michael Borovoy, who was on a mission to promote regional dialogues among national groupings, marked a new beginning. An important outcome of Borovoy's visit was the regional conference, Social Thought and Sociology in the Contemporary Middle East, which was held in Tehran in May 2011. In 2013, Susanne Bastani, a professor of sociology and a board member of the Iranian Sociological Association, was elected to the Executive Council of the Association of Asian Social Science Research Councils. Iranian sociology had emerged from its quarantine. Borovoy's visit was followed by further visits from international sociologists, including Emanuel Wallerstein in 2014, who was greeted, in his own words, like a rock star. Once the association was no longer fighting for its survival, but was instead standing on relatively solid ground, conditions emerged for critical reflection on sociology's role in Iranian society. Some members believe that sustaining and expanding the association necessitates developing closer ties with state agencies. Others contend that the organization must keep a critical distance from the state, which, from what we know, if they actually maintain distance from the state, then there will be no budget for their activities. So that's why it kind of develops some sort of clientelism in some cases. Their concern is that by striving to remain relevant as a problem-solving machine, the association allows the state to set the agenda and delimit the problems to be solved. Aside from the debates regarding the association's relation with the state, other conversations have also been taking place. Among sociologists with reference to the role, responsibility, and commitment of the association to its member and society at large. For example, the president of the Iranian Sociological Association believes it should mediate between community-based organizations and the state and produce knowledge to inform the actions of both. Others would like to see the association as a public space or sphere where they can freely and critically discuss issues pertaining to democratic governance, religious rule, human rights, and regional and international challenges. The association's goal in engaging with societal and state actors has made balancing the three key elements of its work, determining the contours of Iranian sociology, informing public debates, and developing research ties with state agencies, a sensitive and precarious exercise. Some have been quick to suggest that these discussions signal an identity crisis. They might, however, just as well be central to forging an identity for the association and the Iranian sociological community at large. To be sure, doing sociological research in Iran sometimes feels like walking a tightrope, with the constant need to gauge formal restrictions, informal limitations, and the potential political repercussions of seemingly insignificant matters. The Iranian political system is characterized by a complex and internally diverse state marred by conflict between its different segments. Many of them are kind of have authoritarian tendency, but it's also, there's a they have to function in a polarized field, in a field that's polarized between conservative and anti-state radical forces. Due to this complexity, the boundary between what is permissible and what is not is unpredictable and uncertain. The story of the 2011 national conference called Social Pathologies of Iranian Society provides a telling example. All the careful planning, time, energy, and financial investment put into organizing it were effaced almost in an instant. Security forces called the event off as it was about to begin, even though the sponsors of the event included representatives from several ministries and the judiciary. Such occurrences are indicative of how rifts within the state create uncertainty and obstruct the functioning of the association. Occasionally, despite all the precautions, a tightrope walker falls. Sociologists have found themselves framed as so-called threats to national security, interrogated, prosecuted, and incarcerated. Prominent examples from just the past 20 years include pollsters and key reformist figures who were arrested and later prosecuted based on a 400-page indictment alleging that they, quote, engaged in Western-sponsored psychological war operations, unquote. And this was referring to a contract they had with Gallup. The list of sociologists that have been arrested is long. Dual national social scientists conducting research in Iran have also been arrested, such as Fariba Adelkha, French-Iranian social scientist who is currently imprisoned, and Homa Houtfar, Canadian-Iranian social scientist who was interrogated for 112 days. Reflecting on her ordeal, Houtfar said that, quote, being treated like an enemy hurt more than being in jail, unquote. These arrests have heightened the atmosphere of fear surrounding engagement in social research. Less dramatic stories of discrimination on political grounds never make it into the media and remain invisible. Colleagues attest that writing on a blog, attending a specific international workshop, or raising a contentious topic in their classes has resulted in the denial of tenure, suspension of promotions, and being shuffled from one department to another, with negative effects for career development and income. And I have to add here that feminism is absolutely a taboo subject in the classrooms. Sociological research in Iran is conducted against the backdrop of a volatile domestic political scene riddled with unpredictability and uncertainty, and highly sensitive to an increasingly hostile and equally tense international environment. So let me now get to the international constraints. Due to decades of sanctions and misplaced spending priorities, research has been chronically undervalued and placed very low in the government's budget, with the national research allocation falling from 0.5% of GDP in 2019 to 0.3% in 2020, one of the lowest ratios in the Middle East region. Less than 30% of this tiny fraction is allocated to universities and scientific organizations like the Iranian Sociological Association, while the rest of the funds are absorbed by state ministries and agencies. Year after year, incoming funds have been shrinking against rapidly rising operating expenses, which have entailed a 5-fold increase in publication costs for the association's journals over the past decade due to rampant inflation caused by economic sanctions. As a result, the association's publishing activities have shifted to online platforms, while it reduced hard copy print runs to a maximum of 20 to 30 copies, which will make them effectively inaccessible to sociologists in the peripheries and provincial towns. Association members have also found themselves cash-strapped, unable to sustain, let alone expand, their research activities. The financial constraints are also affecting the future of sociology in Iran, as researchers report that they can no longer recruit enthusiastic young students as research assistants and establish practice at the center of mentoring the next generation of the country's research innovators. Budget cuts have adversely affected the state of social research infrastructure and the university sector, and have led to broad changes similar to those in higher education institutions elsewhere, like the ones that Mary was talking about in a few minutes ago. In an effort to balance their constricted budgets, Iran's universities have resorted to employing contingent faculty labor to reduce the costs of paying benefits and higher salaries. Part-time and adjunct faculty reportedly compose more than 60% of the faculty across all universities, and the majority of them are women. The repercussions are considerable. Staff on low salaries often seek a second job, affecting the quality of both their work and life. The crisis that North American and European universities are currently experiencing due to the pandemic has been a chronic condition in Iran. While Iran's integration into the International Sociological Association represented a sea change after years of isolation, the sanctions are rolling back this progress by endangering the access of Iranian sociologists to international professional spaces. For example, although Iranian participants in International Sociological Association meetings and forums have benefited from established tier payment systems designed to mitigate economic disparities, currency devaluations have diminished the effect of this system. Iran's currency has regularly declined in value since 1979, depreciating rapidly, particularly since 2018, when President Trump effectively walked away from the Iran nuclear deal and introduced renewed and more severe sanctions. Colleagues report that they can no longer afford to pay their membership dues or pay for ticket and accommodation costs, which makes participating in international conferences impossible for most. Furthermore, the US sanctions on Iran deter international banks from participating in financial transactions with Iran. For Iranian sociologists, this means that even if they could afford the fees, they would not be able to rely on the domestic banking system to pay them. They would need to have a foreign credit card or reach out to someone who does. The financial costs, coupled with obstacles to obtaining visas, have made participation in international conferences extremely difficult. Sanctions also make scientific collaboration with universities and researchers, especially in North America, almost impossible. Financial barriers in place make it difficult for Iranian sociologists to participate in international projects as co-investigators or research assistants, since funds cannot be transferred to them easily. US-based colleagues working on Iran have time and again recounted instances where the use of their university research funds has been curtailed by the requirement that research assistants be paid directly by the university via wire transfer or check, which is not possible when the research assistant is in Iran. So despite all this, and I have to highlight this here now that I've been given a spot on a plenary session, the same letter that was sent to the International Sociological Association was sent to the American Sociological Association as well, but they felt unable or unwilling to provide support in the form of, or show solidarity in the form of a statement. The constraints on the maintenance of Iranian sociology's outward profile do not constitute a problem for Iran sociologists alone, but create challenges for the internationalization of social sciences in general, which is a central element in the agenda of most international and regional scholarly organizations. World congresses and global forums with sometimes up to 6,000 sociologists in attendance are often marked by an absence of international voices. The distribution of members and conference participants in the International Sociological Association is skewed in favor of Europe, the United States, and Canada, which raises serious concerns about the representativeness of such international forums. In 2018, out of the 6,360 members of the International Sociological Association, only 178, 3%, were from the Middle East and North Africa, making it the most underrepresented region. Let's pause for a second and look at the pie chart together. I have highlighted the names of the countries in each region that constitute more than 50% of the regional members. And you can see that the world is dominated by, the world of sociology is dominated by the US, Canada, Germany, and the UK. And that each region too is dominated by only one or two countries. So I'll just pause for a few seconds so you can go over this chart. So based on this chart, what we call sociology, what we call global sociology, is a truncated version of what it could or claims to be. A strong international sociology should be founded on strong local sociological perspectives that are interconnected and mutually enriching. The national in international must be taken seriously. Thank you. Josephine, you're on mute.
Yes, your paper dovetails quite well with Mary's in the sense of the impact of the economic sanctions on Iran, but at the same time, some of the issues that you raise in terms of the constraints are actually being felt also here in terms of the kind of changes that we are beginning to experience here in the United States under what I think our president would like to think is an authoritarian regime. And the fight for democracy. So there's a lot there that we can pick out and discuss afterwards. Thank you. Our next speaker is, Next speaker is Dr. Melanie Heath. Her talk is on studying the religious right, how to unpack intolerance. Melanie is Associate Professor of Sociology at McMaster University in Ontario, Canada. She studies the politics of family, sexuality, and gender. She is author of numerous articles in Gender and Society, Sociological Perspectives, the Sociological Quarterly, Qualitative Methods, among others. Her book, One Marriage Under God, The Campaign to Promote Marriage in America, was published in 2012 by New York University Press. And she currently has an advanced contract with Stanford University Press for her book, manuscript tentatively titled Forbidden Intimacies, Transnational Regulation of Polygamies at the limits of Western tolerance. She is president of RC32 of the Women, Gender and Society in the International Sociological Association. Welcome, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Josephine. And thank you also to the program committee for making this SWS Summer Conference into a dynamic set of plenaries and workshops. This is really fantastic under the circumstances. So what I'm going to be talking about today is also centering on some of the issues that have been spoken to around authoritarianism, authoritarian regimes. But specifically, I want to turn to the religious right and thinking through religiosity as an important portal for thinking about the ways that gender and sexuality, as well as race, are regulated through these. So I do have a PowerPoint here, so I'm going to share my screen with all of you. Let's see. All right. And wonderful. Okay. So just to begin, I want to begin with something that we're all familiar with. A white, wide-brimmed bonnet and a red cloak have come to be synonymous with women's oppression. Margaret Atwood's 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale, seared this image into our souls with its depiction of a near-future dystopia in which women are forced into reproductive slavery to bear the children of the elite and wear this uniform to underline their subservience. For more than 3 decades, the image has shown up on the covers of books around the world, on posters from the 1990 film, in ads for the 2017 TV series, and even on real women at demonstrations for reproductive rights. When it debuted in 1985, the book reflected the United States' embrace of conservatism, evidenced by the election of Ronald Reagan as president, the increasing power of the Christian right and its powerful lobbying organizations, the Moral Majority, Focus on the Family, and the Christian Coalition, not to mention the rise of televangelism. The Handmaid's Tale has taken on new urgency and meaning with the election of Donald Trump, who was inaugurated just 3 months before the TV series premiered. Trump's authoritarian tendencies and his vice president's anti-gay and anti-abortion beliefs make the book and the series ever more germane. Authoritarian governments around the world mirror the events that take place in The Handmaid's Tale. A government declaring martial law after an attack by extremists, a regime that systematically eliminates gay people, a society that prioritizes procreation and subjugation of women above all else. The relationships between authoritarianism, religious fundamentalism, and attitudes towards sexuality and gender relations are important, I want to address today, to understanding the times in which we live. There is a large body of research that links high church involvement to authoritarian attitudes that are characterized by deference to law and order, conservative gender norms, and intolerance of LGBTQ+ peoples. White nationalism has also been linked to right-wing authoritarianism, defined by a high degree of willingness to submit to authorities, perceived as legitimate. Today, I will discuss these links in studying the religious right to encourage us to think about how to approach these issues from a sociological and feminist framework. So let's begin by examining the research on authoritarianism, which can be defined as a system that involves following powerful individuals and satisfying their expectations. Religious scholars have found that authoritarian people become increasingly religious and less doubtful about their religious beliefs throughout their lives. In addition, authoritarians show more willingness to meet specific requirements, such as going to church, praying, and reading scripture. Authoritarianism often requires submission to both the traditional family and religious authorities. Studies have found that religious people tend to be more sexist, racist, and ethnocentric, as well as having negative attitudes toward GLBTQ+ peoples, characteristics that are linked to authoritarian individuals. Religious fundamentalism is highly correlated with authoritarianism, and some of the negative attitudes of fundamentalists can be explained by their authoritarianism. The marriage of this brand of authoritarianism and the emergence of the religious right in the United States has led to the kind of politics that inspired The Handmaid's Tale. In the United States, the religious right is an informal political coalition formed around a core of conservative evangelical Protestants and Roman Catholics. The movement has its roots in American politics going back to the 1940s and has been especially influential since the 1970s. It is characterized by its grassroots activism and focus on social issues, enabling it to motivate the electorate around those issues. Often abortion is seen as the main issue that galvanized the religious right to mass mobilization, and this has often been given as the main explanation. But in reality, we have some other explanations that are also important. For example, family scholar Randall Balmer argues that one of the main motivating forces in the beginning of the religious right in the 1970s was around race and segregation. So let me provide a brief history of this issue, as I think it's important to understanding the emergence of what is called Christian nationalism. In 1971, the United States District Court ruled in a case called Green versus Connolly that upheld a new IRS policy which states, quote, under the Internal Revenue Code, properly construed, racially discriminatory private schools that are not entitled to the federal tax exemption provided for charitable educational institutions, and persons making gifts to such schools are not entitled to the deductions provided in case of gifts to charitable educational institutions. So Paul Weyrich, the late religious conservative political activist and co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, viewed this case as his opening to build a movement that would embrace politics, right-wing politics, and the Republican Party. The Green versus Connolly ruling was an important first step to building what he called a moral majority. Evangelical leaders were angered as the IRS began sending questionnaires to church-related segregation academies, including Falwell's own Lynchburg Christian School, inquiring about their racial policies. Falwell was furious. He quoted, "In some states, it's easier to open a massage parlor than a Christian school." In 1976, after years of warnings to Bob Jones University, a fundamentalist college in Greenville, South Carolina, that they must integrate or pay taxes, the IRS rescinded the school's tax exemption. This case provided the first impetus for the religious right. Although abortion emerged as a rallying cry by 1980, the real roots of the religious right lie not in the defense of a fetus, but in the defense of racial segregation. The history of racial backlash that has propelled the religious right, in combination with backlash against feminism and LGBTQ rights, provides perspective on what is known as Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism is Christianity-affiliated religious nationalism. It focuses primarily on internal politics, such as passing laws that reflect specific views of Christianity, and its role in political and social life. Americans who identify with the tenets of Christian nationalism believe that the United States has a distinctive Christian national identity, including its sacred symbols and public policies. As a cultural framework, it draws on a collection of myths, traditions, symbols, narratives, and value systems that speak to a particular national identity used to defend claims to power. Research has uncovered that adherents to Christian nationalism often understand the need to defend the symbolic boundaries of what it means to be American by ethno-religious prejudice and xenophobia. An example are studies showing Americans who believe in a strong connection between Christianity and American civil life often also hold antipathy towards immigrants. Christian nationalism is also strongly associated with gender traditionalism. A study by Whitehead and Perry found that identifying the degree to which Americans embrace Christian nationalism tells us more about their views of traditional gender norms in society than knowing their political views, religious beliefs, behaviors, and affiliation, or even their gender. They argue, quote, when Christian nationalism encourages reconstructing America according to traditional religious ideals, this entails a cultural shift toward a more traditional patriarchal gender ideology. There's a strong link between Christian nationalism and authoritarianism in emphasizing traditional and authoritarian social arrangements, especially concerning gender traditionalism. Americans who embrace Christian nationalism are nostalgic for a past when patriarchal family arrangements were the norm. These individuals call for a return to what they see as God's design for families. These links are present in a social movement that I studied back in the 1990s, which is currently seeking a revival. It's the Promise Keepers. The Promise Keepers, next slide, was a movement, or is a movement, that grew in the 1990s with the goal of transforming and altering the norms of masculinity among evangelical men by challenging men to establish their leadership role in the family. Bill McCartney, then the head football coach at the University of California at Boulder, founded the movement in 1990, inspired by his dream to fill a sports stadium with men, not to watch football, but to enact a godly manhood. He realized his vision as the movement grew from a small gathering in 1991 to millions of men attending stadium events nationwide, especially witnessed by the sea of men who gathered at the National Mall in December in Washington, D.C. in 1997 for the Stand in the Gap gathering. Since its peak in 1997, attendance has ebbed, but the organization has endured. The philosophy of the Promise Keepers has focused on the changing meaning of manhood, and a goal of the organization has been to unify men of different races and socioeconomic backgrounds under a single Christian banner. The most controversial aspect has revolved around its stated mission, quote, the making of godly men, which includes recovering men's leadership positions within their families and communities. In studying the Promise Keepers, I sought to uncover how these men and their wives understood masculinity. Since the late 1980s, sociologists have theorized the way that masculinity involves multiple contextual and historically shifting configurations. My research examined how PK men embrace a softer image of masculinity as enlightened, quote unquote, but still hierarchical to maintain their position as leaders. Large stadium events allowed non-privileged men to participate along those who were privileged, while at the same time maintaining a racial hierarchy that does little to address the structural inequalities that marginalize men of color. PK men were able to be more emotionally expressive, but only in spaces without women to ward off possible challenges to their heterosexuality that could also challenge the gender hierarchy. It is perhaps unsurprising that in our current political climate, the Promise Keepers organization has been seeking a huge comeback. On July 31st and August 1st of this year, it held a free 2-day virtual event, bringing together men from more than 65 countries to hear from former sports figures, Christian musicians, and famous pastors and authors. Organizers had originally hoped to draw 80,000 men to a stadium outside Dallas for their first major arena-based event in close to a decade. The leaders noted that, quote, what seemed like a huge disappointment ended up being a huge blessing. In fact, the event was broadcast to a huge conglomeration of churches in India. It was translated into Hindi, and throughout South America, translated into Spanish, as well as Polish. This global movement of religious rights values is also a very important component that feminist scholars and gender sociologists must keep in mind in understanding the connection between authoritarianism and religion. So in 2018, Moldova hosted the World Congress of Families, an American initiative that promotes family values worldwide. It gathered under the theme, Uniting East and West. The opening ceremonies featured a performance by Moldovan women and girls in virginal white dresses with projected images of girls frolicking in the countryside in the background. Over the course of the 2-day conference, a nearly annual event in which politicians and activists from around the world gathered to forge relationships, this rural natalist vision was repeatedly described as under attack by the threat of decadent liberalism, a global menace imposing gender ideology, aggressive feminism, and death culture on the natural family. This conference represented the religious right's increasing embrace of the rising right-wing authoritarianism in Eastern countries such as Moldova. Many religious right leaders believe that America is no longer a role model for the rest of the world. For them, the unrestrained liberalism has brought a once great nation to its knees. The religious right is now turning to authoritarian regimes across the Atlantic to be the standard bearers in a global battle for traditional values. In 1997, Alan Carlson helped found the World Congress of Families to respond to what he had called the shared crisis of declining marriage and fertility rates in the United States, Europe, and the former Soviet bloc. The goals of the conference are to fight against secularization, urbanization, and family planning that leaders believe will lead to a fertility crisis in the West. For Carlson, America has a new role model, Viktor Orban, the autocratic Prime Minister of Hungary, who hosted the 2017 World Congress. Carlson wrote in 2017, quote, "If we want to make America great again, we should follow Orban's lead." Tony Perkins, the influential president of the Family Research Council, the leading Christian right political advocacy group in Washington, and a partner of the World Congress of Families, praised Orban as, quote, "a strong conservative that literally has championed biblical values in Hungary," on his radio program in 2018. After interviewing a Hungarian government representative about his country's immigration restrictions and NGO crackdowns, Perkins, who was appointed by Trump to a post on the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom, said, quote, "I, for one, appreciate the strong stand that Prime Minister Orban has taken." These kinds of global connections between religious right and autocratic leaders underscore the importance of feminist research that is comparative and considers the global movements of conservative ideals. Racial backlash is a key factor. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 was a shock for many religious conservatives. Under Obama, the federal government took steps to protect the rights of trans people, required employers' health insurance plans to cover contraceptives, and Obama appointees to the Supreme Court helped make marriage equality the law of the land. Republican leaders and religious right activists stoked fear that America was losing its treasured, quote, "city on a hill" status, the mythology that the American nation had a divine or has a divine mission to be a beacon of freedom and democracy to the world. They further argued that American democracy is stifling the freedom of conservative Christians. These events have led to the great paradox that white evangelicals have been a key constituency in electing and supporting Donald Trump. So exit polls from the 2016 election showed that Trump received overwhelming support, 81%, from white evangelicals or born-again Christians. The great paradox asks how these Christians can support a morally compromised candidate who is, so we might say, unchristian. Trump has no concrete religious affiliation and lacks any understanding of Christian doctrine. Since the election, he has been untruthful, radically narcissistic, unsympathetic, and downright immoral, yet white evangelicals stay with him. Sarah Diefendorf conducted ethnographic research on a white upper middle class evangelical megachurch from 2016 to 2018. She found that while Christian nationalism and racial backlash are important, sexual politics are also key to understanding why white evangelicals would vote for such an unsavory figure. She argues that the current political and cultural climate has pushed evangelicals to tolerate quite a bit in defense of heterosexuality. While white evangelicals have experienced great social mobility in the last decades, they have at the same time lost ground in having cultural influence to see their values upheld in many facets of American society. Interestingly, she finds that evangelicals have moved away from previous strategies promoting moral campaigns against homosexuality, such as Pray the Gay Away projects. Now they focus their energies on discussions of heterosexuality and the ways to protect the sacred covenant of marriage. Diefendorf states, as evangelicals put up a defense around heterosexuality, they pivot away from a previous focus on countering sexual deviance. This shows that evangelicals are taking a much more practical approach to upholding their values. In voting behavior, they are willing to support candidates who defend Christianity, even if just in words and not actions. They are willing to look beyond sexual misbehavior to find candidates who will defend Christian values and protect Christian beliefs in the United States. Diefendorf's work points to the importance of gender and sexuality scholarship that examines the ways that the religious right is evolving. Evangelicals are willing to vote for leaders who live up to the old adage, do as I say and not as I do. So in conclusion, this brief survey of the relationship between authoritarianism and the religious right emphasizes the need for careful feminist research that is guided by intersectional frameworks and attention to the shifting ways that conservative religions are being lived on a global basis. The discovery and careful documentation of the relationship between the religious right, Christian nationalism, and authoritarianism can shed light on the ways that religion helps to sustain gender, sexual, and racial hierarchies. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Melanie. These terms are very important when we think about them: religious rights, fundamentalism, authoritarianism, because they neoliberalism too, actually, and how they're impacting our lives in so many different ways. We'll come back to that when we're having the discussions. So our last speaker is Dr. Eloísa Martin, and she's speaking on Neoliberalism is the New Authoritarian, Reflections on Teaching, Research, and Academic Freedom. Eloísa is an associate professor of sociology at the United Arab Emirates University and Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She's on leave from there. She is the vice president for publications of the International Sociological Association and the co-chair of CEFIS, the South to South Exchange Program for the research on the history of development. She has served as elected executive secretary and vice president of the Association of Social Scientists of Religion in Mercosur, and she was Latin American board member 2010 to 18 and secretary treasurer of the International Sociological Association Research Committee on Sociology of Religion 2014 to 18. Between 2010 to 17, she was the editor of Current Sociology when she created and implemented a successful program of academic writing for Global South scholars that increased the presence of non-hegemonic authors in the journal. Her research interests focus on the sociology of religion, especially on theory, Catholicism, and popular religion. And since working in the United Arab Emirates, she is now leading a research project on Emirati food and culture. Welcome, Eloísa. I know you still have a bit of jet lag, but we're glad you're here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Very pleased to be part of this plenary. And my talk gets into dialogue with the previous papers. So I think I will try to be brief so we can have some kind of discussion. My talk is based in an ethnography, I will say, an ethnographic account of teaching and research in the Global South, particularly in the Emirates and in Brazil. my questions are both personal and practical, and therefore are political and epistemological. And I would like to highlight how these teaching and research challenges in neoliberal universities in the Global South impacts directly on academic freedom. I will start by saying that there is a kind of academic common sense and common sense as a whole as well, that authoritarianism is something that happens in general in the Global South, I mean, historically, or an anomaly in the Global North. In opposition, I would like to say that authoritarianism is entrenched in the deepest roots of capitalist state in itself, following Guillermo O'Donnell theory of bureaucratic authoritarian state. So when I joke in the title saying that neoliberalism is the new authoritarianism, in fact, it's not new, it's part of it. But how this authoritarianism appears in higher education, in teaching and research? Well, I have two experiences to share with you in two very different, let's say, economical contexts in Brazil and in the UAE. Talking about teaching first, I would like to say that the impact of authoritarian policies and authoritarian practices within the teaching setting started immediately after, like say, in the current context, immediately after the COP in 2016 that removed Dilma Rousseff from government and put his vice president, Michel Temer, as president. At that moment, and following in following years with Bolsonaro presidency, we have witnessed and experienced spies in classrooms. I mean, clearly military in civilian clothes, calls for denouncing professors, like a toll-free number offered by a congressman from the right-wing part, one of the right-wing parties, to denounce professors that, you know, try to ideologize in classroom, being that discussing gender, of course, but also teaching Marxism and things like that. I mean, in fact, one professor that was teaching Marxism was denounced by this phone number in the ministry, in the public ministry. So it was a proper judiciary process that he has to run into that to demonstrate that teaching Marx in social science is not ideology, it's just social theory. And of course, all that it deals with gender roles, gender issues, and LGBTQ. In fact, a few years, 2 years ago, one professor was denounced and sued by his master student, her master student, because she alleged she was induced into feminism. She chose her director, his dissertation tutor, that is a very well-known feminist theorist in Brazil. And after that, she changed her mind, and instead of changing, let's say, director because of her religious beliefs, she decides to sue her. So this professor has to go into a very long judiciary process in order to defend herself of these allegations. At the end of the day, of course, she won, but she spent and she lost 3 years of her life dealing with this kind of issue. So this situation put to professors and faculty as a whole into a very complicated situation, not just those that teach gender issues or Marxist theory or inequality or race and ethnic issues, but in my case specifically, I was teaching at that time social theory. And it was really complicated to teach social theory current examples, because students start to record the class, take pictures, and as a foreigner myself, I was strongly recommended to avoid any kind of, let's say, complicated discussion in classroom, because we all knew at that time, as it's happened today, that we were being observed and recorded, and everything can go into internet and into YouTube, and this could, at the end of the day, end in a judiciary process, or in my case, in deportation because of this national security law. This is Brazil. Let's move to the UAE, which the situation is similar but completely different. When I moved to the UAE, I was invited to teach there in order to improve the sociology department. I was advised in my first day that the topics that I was not supposed to talk about in classroom or raise with the student. Gender issues, LGBTQ issues, and of course, criticizing the government, and curiously, dating, like going into a date, boyfriend-girlfriend discussion was completely out of the question. I say, okay, so I cannot talk about gender roles. No, they told me, you can talk about gender roles. Even you can talk about feminism. And I say, okay, how can I talk about feminism without talking about queer studies or LGBTQ issues? No, that you cannot talk about. But you can talk about feminism as equality. Say, okay, let's find a middle term, let's compromise, so I can use this topic. However, when I was about to choose the textbook, the textbook was censored because it didn't fit, they told me, with the national and religious values. So I was trying to find some kind of compromise, and all the time, and this is the most curious thing, dealing with students that are in contact with internet, they have Instagram, they have Twitter, and they have access to almost everything, and they have questions, and they ask professors to discuss things. And one of my students told me she was very upset because in sociology of family, the professor started the class telling them, okay, we are going to discuss family, let's say mother, father, children already married. And the girls started, and I'm saying the girls because teaching is gender secluded and sociology only has female students, started to say, okay, let's talk about dating. I said, no, dating is forbidden, dating is not allowed, dating is not, I'm not quoting, but I'm just explaining, a sin and therefore a crime in the UAE. That's why we cannot even talk about that, even though students date. So, and ultimately, the problem with the teaching is that since you cannot criticize politics, I'm not talking about just the government, I'm not talking just about the royal family. You cannot talk about, for example, you cannot even talk about Trump in the classroom because Trump is an ally. So it's hard even to find examples to discuss inequality, to discuss societal issues, not to mention, of course, racism, migration. These are completely out of the question. But then the thing and my challenge in everyday teaching is how to improve or how to produce or how to push forward critical thinking if you're not able to criticize, let's say. This regarding teaching. Regarding research, both in Brazil and in the UAE, sociology has a very, very shy presence in the public debate. public debate, you can find in Brazil social scientists, social analysts that are not exactly sociologists. And in the UAE, of course, you have this kind of sociologists generally appear to discuss quantitative data or you know, trends in statistics, but never to talk about social problems. But when we talk about research in the Global South, one of the things that I found more striking is to decide what is possible to research in terms of certain kind of constraints regarding funding, certain kind of etiquette, because as Global South, and this does not matter if you are a rich country as the UAE or a poor country as Brazil is, a certain etiquette regarding those countries that are hegemonic, that are mainstream in the geopolitics of knowledge. So, and this is not new. Let's say you are not criticizing Brazilian Studies Association or Latin American Studies Association and its colonial practices. Otherwise, you are not invited. Otherwise, you are not part of certain groups or certain discussions in the international arena. And in some sense, this also applies to global sociology as a whole. But something even more interesting and important is it is in these partnerships and international collaboration. One thing that I've found in my entire career, but more and more recently because of the unequal distribution of funds and grants, is a certain colonial practices and entitlement from global north scholars towards their colleagues in the global south, that runs from a PhD students email faculty in Global South University to ask them to prepare for them their fieldwork. Just send me the email, just contact me with people because I only have 2 months to do my fieldwork, so I have only 2 months. So you have to prepare everything for me. And I said, what? For one side, but in the other side, certain practices of plagiarism disguised into informant talk. So using scholars, their colleague scholars as informants, not quoting them, or directly plagiarism into undergrad students' research and data. First. Second things regarding funding and inequality distribution of funding, as also Nazanin highlight. How do research without funding and how the funds are distributed impact on what we are able to do and how we are going to participate in the global sociological context. So funding defines relevance. Funding defines that nowadays we have a higher impact on applied sociology in contrast with, let's say, pure or theoretical sociology that also is absolutely needed in order to construct relevant knowledge. And the other things have to do, when it deals with research, with ethics, and ethics within the institutions. I'm not talking just about certain groups that are not going to sign an agreement, a consensual agreement of participating of research. Of course, if you're researching, I don't know, crime or drug dealers or even certain elites, they're not going to sign. If you are researching right-wing groups, especially in Brazil, they are not going to sign an ethical agreement. But besides that, I think that even more important is how to do research when your own institution doesn't want you to do research on that topic. So for example, and that's the joke, I just arrived to the UAE after 5 months stranded abroad because of the travel bans. And one thing that I discovered is that selection of people to come back is very not arbitrary, it's very, very arbitrary. And there is people, I mean, in order to come back, I have to apply for an authorization to come back. And there's a lot of people, including some of my colleagues, that has not been authorized to return and have been rejecting again and again and again, up to 20+ times. So, and they're not, I mean, without this authorization, you cannot come back. And this put into question things about belonging and home. And of course, I'm not even talking about citizenship that you are not allowed to have here in the UAE, but belonging. I mean, people that live here for 10, 15, 20 years that just travel and not allowed to come back and should return home, but there's no home to return to. And so I thought, okay, let's do a research on that. And I am participating in Facebook groups and discuss with people. And I was just to say, don't do that. I mean, your research is not going through the ethical approval just because even the questions and even the topic is, let's say, the love to the country and belonging and being part of that. Your questions could raise certain kind of criticism that university is not going to allow you to pursue. So how to do sociology in this context? By the other side, both in Brazil and the UAE, they are betting and they're investing in being part of the international competition of universities and higher education as productivity and metrics and being up into the charts, because it has to do with, for example, with whom you are able to do collaboration or funding or things like that. And of course, it has an impact in individual careers, specifically if you are part of, if you want an international career and mobility. And this is very, very central. I mean, trying to run just to make it and give time for some discussion, because at the end of the day, what is in question is, at this advanced stage of meritocratic capitalism, the knowledge that we are expected to produce in this neoliberal university is more and more standardized, more and more homogenized in order to get into the ranks, in order to get into the metrics. And at the end of the day, what is at stake is, what is the role of university? What is the social role? What is the purpose of university as a space for research and teaching? And what kind of knowledge are we producing? Is the university a safe space, a sanctuary for knowledge production and free speech and, let's say, free thinking? Or is university, as it looks like, more and more a factory that just produces accreditation, certification, and diplomas? And what to do about that? ISA has taken some policies, particularly in the Human Rights Committee, which I chair, and also Nazanin is part of it, and is trying to enlarge the definition of human rights to include freedom as a whole, and include also the discussion of economic, let's say, limits, economic sanctions, and economic constraints towards research. This is a challenge. We are working on that, but the important thing is that when we move freedom of speech from only the political idea or only the political ideologies into considering the economical constraint and basically the material conditions of production of knowledge, we can now discuss how these things happen both in global north and global south, and consider that it's a problem that affects us globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eloísa. Thank you all four speakers. I'm so glad if this was so representative of these issues in a global perspective. And as I listened to all four of them, the two things that came into my mind, I kept on thinking about the neoliberal capitalist educational institutions and what we have to address within these processes as they impact our universities and what we research, what we teach, what kind of knowledge we produce. And I also kept on thinking about the concept of intersectionality, that in order to explain all of these, how do we address these challenges? How do we navigate them? How are we trying to find ways of challenging to bring about the kind of transformation we want in the future? You have to use an intersectional lens, because all of these things are linked, whether we're talking about the global south or the global north. They're all impacting our lives in a particular way, especially as we teach in the academy, and also in terms of our own personal lives, whether we're talking about gender, sexuality, class, our race, citizenship. And these are all things also that affect the work that we do in terms of our research, our teaching, and our pedagogy. So for example, when you looking at what Melanie was talking about, just taking the Promise Keepers as an example, how do you teach this to your students about the Promise Keepers? How does it relate to authoritarianism and religious fundamentalism? What are the implications, whether we're looking at it within our local context or globally or regionally and so on? And so I think all of these presentations interrelated very well today, and they help us begin to think about what Eloísa said at the end. What is the role of the university in all of these? What are we teaching? What kind of knowledge are we producing? How do we address things like funding, ethics, and pedagogy? How do we address all of these, no matter whether we're in the UAE or Brazil or Canada or the United States? All of these issues are impacting us in a particular way right now. And I know that there are quite a few people out there who are ready to speak, so I'll just leave it at that. But so we'll start with, thank you very much again. I'll start with, we have some questions. I'll start with Bandana. She says that, well, first of all, she said to Eloísa, some of our professors here and SWS members are facing similar issues in their universities. And these are things that we've been struggling with actually during this period of the coronavirus, trying to find ways in which we can address the needs and concerns of our members that are not being addressed by the institution, so that our professional organizations are now in a position where they can use the space of the organization to address these concerns of our members. So the question that Bandana asked is there one thing, and this is to all four speakers, is there one thing you want to tell senior scholars like me, this is what you need to do right now to ensure authoritarianism is challenged? And what would that be? What recommendations would you make as to what we need to start thinking about doing? So if you can keep your answers fairly short, because we've got about 20 minutes left, and I know there are already 5 other questions waiting. So who would like to start? The question again is there one thing you want to tell senior scholars? This is what we might want to do right now to ensure that authoritarianism is being challenged. And what recommendations would you give? What would that be?
I'll take a shot at it. I think that it's important for senior faculty to take the lead, and in taking the lead, it also to take the heat on issues and to be as protective to those that do not have tenure or in vulnerable situations, because as we know, the higher education is a very hierarchical institution. Along with that, I think that we constantly have to be pushing for practices that promote democratic engagement, and that we really resist the administration's attempts to create the state corporatization of our educational systems.
Thank you, Mary. Anybody? I definitely think this is one of the things that organizations like SWS, ASA, and so on, I think coming together and beginning to work together as a united front to challenge as professional organizations some of these policies that are being instituted in universities is one way also that I think we can begin to challenge and show that we're out there and we're watching. Aisha Adaranjo from Nigeria, she says, I can really relate to what Eloísa is saying. These issues also resonate in the sociology space in Nigeria. And I think that that's definitely a point I think a lot of scholars in Global South context would definitely say. But as I said, even in the United States now, these issues are happening here. There's a question from Nazanin to everyone. This all points to the fact that despite all the national differences that we try to highlight here, most of what sociologists undergo in diverse contexts from Nigeria to Iran, Brazil, and the UAE, and even the US, they are similar, hence the need for transnational connections, exactly, yeah. Let me see. Vicky Demos says, I'm looking for questions, but I'm seeing comments more. So Vicky Demos says, thank you to the panelists for raising critical questions. Debadatta Chakravorty, thank you so much for the presentations. Many of these trends are also increasingly seen in Indian academia now under the fascist right-wing government in India. There is rampant rewriting of history and editing of school textbooks that the current government is undertaking. There's also a crackdown on the research topics that professors can undertake in the universities so that it aligns more with a right-wing ideology. More and more left-leaning intellectuals and even student activists are arrested and undergo the pandemic. The crackdown has been increased even more. Solange looks like she wants to ask a question. I think you need to write it down in the chat. Negin Saheb Java, thank you, Eloísa, for raising these same issues exist in the sociological research sphere in Iran, which is Nazanin explained, is due to a combination of the theoretic neoliberal system with a history of censorship and financial constraints. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to think a little bit about Vandana's question, but if the economic constraint is one of the issues, it's not just about, I mean, doing statements and participating in the public arena is fundamental, but something that could be in a more discreet way and still is very powerful is senior scholars are in key roles regarding grant reviews, publication reviews, and decisions about university tenures, etc. So I guess, I mean, we have to revise the certain issues regarding who is getting the grants and how we measure merit. And that's why I think that observing the material conditions of production is key. I'm not talking about just, you know, considering that a woman could have children, so you give 2 extra years for publication, etc. But considering that the golden standard is a white male standard, white male Western standard. So if, you know, I face that as a reviewer as well. I mean, observing this candidate and the other candidate, and I say, okay, yes, what the golden standard has done to improve the community, even the academic community, to be able to, you know, get the grant. I guess certain things, not just about quotas. Quotas are important, representation is important, but it's far from being enough. We have to revise the standards. We have to revise these kind of things. And this is something that I cannot do. This is something that the senior scholars can do, because you are in these positions. That's what I will ask. Now I thought about that.
Yeah, that's a good, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, yeah.
If I can, I'd just like to follow up on that thought, because I think, Eloísa, you're exactly right. It's, you know, the senior scholarship is so important. And I also think it's so important for feminist scholars to take on positions of administration in universities. For example, in my university in Canada, you know, Canada is often seen as this much more progressive country, but in our university, we have a largely white male administration who makes decisions that are not sensitive to diversity, to women's issues, to discrimination, and they reproduce themselves over and over again. So I've spent time trying to speak out against these practices. And I think, you know, also it's just important as much as possible for us as feminist scholars to try to take on those positions as well when possible, to be able to shape those policies.
Yes, that's true. It does tend to be sometimes the associate professors and the junior professors who are willing to stick their necks out, and yet they're more vulnerable than the senior professors who are more established now and can, but they're so wrapped up in their research sometimes they don't have time to kind of, and they need to be there to support and to nurture and to build the capacity also of their junior colleagues, so that they know that they have their back when these issues come up. Thank you, Melanie. There's a question here by Roberta Villalon to Mary Romero, but she says others too. Here we're talking to a group that shares these ideas and have similar analyses of the current situation. But how do you deal with talking to others who are either on the right or, more disturbingly, keeping an apolitical, apathetic position, sometimes to preserve what they have, other times because they don't have a political structural analysis of the situation. But of course, their attitude feeds authoritarian forces.
I think that's a very difficult question, and I've seen over the years faculty and committees, associations refusing to take action on something because they feel that they may offend the status quo, or that in some ways it may endanger the larger group. And I think we just have to take a critical perspective on it, and we have to help them see understand the analysis. But it is very difficult to break through those status quo kinds of decision-making processes that go on. It tends to silence the rest of us. I would like to hear if others have any ideas on this issue.
Anybody? Okay, well, we'll go on to the next question then. This is from Layla Music, and what is the position of and the question is to everyone. What is the position of female sociologists inside? No, it's for Nazanin. What is the position of female sociologists inside the Iranian Sociological Association? It's for Nazanin.
Sure. So, in short, actually, the Iranian Sociological Association is more kind of, it's closer to gender equality than the university sector itself. So, for example, from the 11 board members of the Iranian Sociological Association, 4 are women. And as I mentioned, one of the board members got elected as the vice president of the Association for Asian Social Science Council Research. So they're actually very active. There's a very active group on women's studies. So I did say feminism is a taboo in the classroom. For those who don't know the university structure, the most prestigious universities in Iran are actually state-owned and are public universities, and that's kind of the majority of the universities that are there. So inside the classrooms, pretty much the contents are regulated or are monitored, not as extreme as Eloísa was talking about the UAE or even Brazil, but they're monitored. But the association, just like a civil society organization, it's kind of has created this alternative space where some of these taboo subjects can be discussed. And so they have a very active women's gender and women's studies working group that brings in the audience and kind of organizes workshops and talks quite often. And so just tying this back to what Bandana was saying, was asking us, I think one of the, it's not just a matter of seniority. Those of us who are in a privileged position that we can speak up or stand for, that's why I brought up the idea, the notion that I was surprised that the ASA was not even willing to kind of issue a statement in support of the letter that we received, because those of us who are in a privileged position or in kind of secure positions, then I think we have a responsibility and obligation to speak up, speak to the people who cannot, and then speak for them at some point as well. I think during the COVID, at least one thing that I'm doing right now is that Zoom, despite all its problems, has opened up a space where you can kind of create these transnational connections more easily. So it's kind of trumping the effects of, you know, travel bans and financial problems. So I am kind of reconnecting with the Iranian universities to do that. Just very quickly, the university students, the majority of university students in Iran are female. But I think the pattern, like everywhere else, the higher up you go, the more the gender hierarchy changes. So the gender composition changes. So the assistant professors, still you have more women, but then associate professors, there are less women. At the level of the professors of sociology, you even have less. And many of it has to do with the complications that there are for studying gender and women's issues as well.
Thank you. Sure. This question is by Laura Jinka, and it says, I too would like to know more of I too would like to know more about what scholars can do. I will say our college president spoke at a Black Lives Matter march, and he used terms that often get criticized: structural racism, white supremacy, pervasive inequality. It was a first. He's on a commission within the US executive administration. His words were a first and important, but I wonder if it is above the university. Is it work policies in general that can protect others too? That's generally for everybody. Well, I think that sounds a lot of, we have had that too at my university, and I was at something with our provost, and they do use, you know, he knew all the right words and terms to use and everything. But then there's also the issue of when it comes down to the bureaucracy and actually trying to, some of the promises actually he made to the faculty, there are limits as to what they can do, because at many of these universities you have these regions, board of regents and so on, who are very, very conservative. And that impacts what, even if you have the mind to address some of these issues, you know, there are limitations to it. So it's yeah. There's a question here by Solange, and she says, beyond the authoritarian states, the speakers did bring up the issue of growing authoritarianism in civil society, specifically in the classroom. Nazanin mentioned that feminism is taboo in Iran. I would like to ask her to what extent this goes beyond state censorship and is also imposed or contested by students.
I'll just start and then I let others contribute to that. So, I mean, I'm obviously just talking about the Iranian context, and I was hoping that through the talk, it was clear that despite all the constraints, the Iranian civil society remains very vibrant. So I think that's what kind of puts it in a different position from what, for example, Eloísa was talking about. So the classroom or the society, civil society is not homogeneous. beyond the state, and what I wanted to also say is that still one of the few spaces for critical discussion that's remained is the classroom, is the university, and is the associations like the Iranian Sociological Association. So critical conversations, critical discussions happen. Usually it's at the, as I talked about, it's walking a tightrope. So these discussions are brought to the classrooms by some professors, and there is a vibrant, heated discussion in the classroom. The problem is that those, I can say in the classroom, they are in minority, but those in minority who raise then issues about, you know, why was the notion of feminism brought up? Why was gender as a non-binary category was even discussed in the classroom? They then have the support of the state, and they then have the power to, so the minority in the classroom is actually supported, and their actions sometimes abusive in terms of verbal abuse. They're sanctioned by the university authorities and by the state. So that's the issue. But aside from these kind of incidents that happen here and there, what I said is that the problem with the Iranian context is that the line between what's permissible and what's not permissible is not really clear cut. So this makes it actually a very exciting and intriguing context to work in and be a sociologist, because anything can be possible, but it's also very scary because you could be talking about the environment and the weather or water pollution, and that could be considered political, and that could get you in jail. So it's also very risky. And I think it's this fine line between what's permissible and what's not. So the red lines are not that clear. That's what I'm trying to say here.
Thank you. This question is for Nazanin and Eloísa, but I'll focus on Eloísa so that, both Dr. Shahrokni and Dr. Martin, actually to everyone, spoke about the colonial practices and entitlements enjoyed by academics in the global north over that of, I think it should be global south. How can this be structurally opposed within academia when global imperialist practices within which academia operates makes it well entrenched?
I will try to be brief, and I think there is one thing that could be done fast and will change a lot. That is the citation practices in research projects and in publications. If you are from the global north academia and you're working in a research in the global south, you cannot definitely avoid or ignore what is produced in this region regarding whatever topics you are talking about. And it doesn't matter if you don't read the language, because for us, which our first language, even second language, is not English, we are forced to read the mainstream literature. So if we start as reviewers to consider research projects and articles for publication that are researching Global South, are not citing any scholar, either in English or in the original language on the topic, well, this cannot pass. So this is a very practical, small thing that could be done in order to change this kind of entitlement or colonialistic practice.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here by Roberta. I think it's directed to Mary. Do you think that contextualizing our analysis and strengthening alliances across institutions and borders can help? Right now, it seems that collective responses can be stronger, but also can be polarizing. I wonder then, is polarization avoidable at all? Seems inevitable, maybe part of a long-term process that we need to traverse.
You're on mute, Mary.
She's muted. Yeah.
As past president of ASA, I have seen that the elected officers in the executive office is more likely to be supportive of signing on to something rather than creating their their own document and being the leader in this. This wasn't always the case with ASA, but they have certainly taken a very legalistic, a very cautious step in terms of protecting their wealth, protecting their status, which is very discouraging. But I still see that they are willing to sign on when other associations are willing to move first.
Yeah, that's something that we're struggling with also in SWS. Try not to get to that point where, you know, you have to conform in so many different ways. But we're trying to initiate our own statements on things as well as endorsing other statements. So the last, this is just a comment because we're at 3 o'clock. This is from Nagin Saheb Jahava, and she's a student. She said, I'd like to just add from a student perspective that the censorship and isolation in research is not limited to students doing research inside, for example, Iran. I'm an Iranian student studying in Canada, and like many others, I had to change my research topic on a topic on Iranian society because the ethics board of my university in Canada softly encouraged me not to, because approving the ethics for research in Iran is a concern for them. This is a trending process among Iranian students that like to conduct research in Iran, which is a way for us to push Iranian sociology forward. But we are discouraged, and some use change paths like I did. Whether the risks are there or are just fears of not being able to go back home, the censorship and isolation in sociology extends beyond Iran's borders. And I think at least the ethics board of universities outside of Iran could support by discouraging such projects. So that's just a comment. But we're at 3 o'clock now. I'd like to, I thought this was an excellent plenary. Thank you so much. I mean, we just got so much rich information, and the bringing it, for looking at everything from a global perspective, as opposed to just focusing on the United States, and then zeroing into issues like looking at the role of the religious right and how all of that plays into all of these issues and neoliberalism, and what should we be doing and thinking and challenging as universities and as professional organizations as well. I know that we'll be talking about these for a long time, but for today, I just want to thank Dr. Eloísa Martin, Dr. Melanie Heath, Dr. Mary Romero, and Dr. Nazanin Shahrokni. Today's the first time I'm meeting you, by the way, Nazanin. We've communicated a long time, but we met today virtually. Thank you very much indeed. And please enjoy the rest of the presentations at the conference. Thank you. Thank you everybody for coming. And also I'd like to use this opportunity to thank the Program Planning Committee for putting everything together. Mary Beth Stout, who's chair of the Program Planning Committee, Solange Simos, Sasha Drummond-Lewis, Barrett, Katuna, Natasha, Santana, Christelle, I've forgotten Christelle's last name, and myself. Thank you, everybody.